Yeah, so before turning over to Yana, I want to read the land acknowledgement from the University of New Mexico. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. And I'd also like personally to add that acknowledgements like this one are only a first step. And so I just want to share with you all links to 2 organizations located here in New Mexico where you can learn more and get involved. The first is the Red Nation, and the second is the Pueblo Action Alliance. And I'll post those links in the chat and encourage you all to take a look. There they are. And so I turn over to Yana now. Thank you.
Thank you. And hello, everybody. My name is Yana. I'm a graduate student of Dr. Pearson's, and I'm having the pleasure of introducing him to you today. Dr. Pearson is professor in the Department of Anthropology here at UNM, where he is teaching since 1999. His research follows 2 main themes. These are human evolution, particularly the fossil evidence for the origin of modern humans. And second, the functional adaptation of the skeleton to habitual activity. This latter research theme involves largely the analysis of cross-sectional geometry of human long bones, a topic on which he has published a series of chapters and papers, often together with his graduate students. Currently, he is involved in the analysis of a late Neanderthal from Israel, which is just one of several ongoing collaborative projects that he's involved in. Most importantly for today's talk, since 2007, he has been collaborating with the doctors Zelalem Assefa, Pleurdeau, Erella Hovers, Asfawossen Asrat, and others on the excavation and analysis of materials from Goda Buticha in Ethiopia. Thus far, the project has generated 4 peer-reviewed journal articles, co-authored by Dr. Pearson, and more are to come. So please welcome Dr. Pearson and enjoy his talk, A Window on Human Persistence Amid Major Climatic Change, the Late Pleistocene-Holocene site of Goda Buticha, Ethiopia.
Thank you very much, Yana. So let me go ahead and get started. Can everybody see my cursor on the screen? I want to make sure. Okay, wonderful. And so let me go ahead and get started. I'd like to start with saying a few words about where this research took place, and that's Ethiopia. Oops. So Ethiopia is a large country in the Horn of Africa, which you see here. It's actually bigger than Texas. It's actually 1.59 times the size of Texas. Like many African countries, it's immense. It's also made up of a kind of an interesting mosaic of peoples. There are several ethnic groups. This map gives a percentage by population of some of the largest ones. The Amhara are historically dominant. The empire of Ethiopia was largely an Amhara enterprise. Of the peoples today, the Oromo people in the south are the largest single ethnic group. And the research that we did is among Oromo people. Today, Ethiopia has a system of government that's sometimes referred to as ethnic federalism, which I think was intended to try to give each group a say in their own affairs, but has also tended to reinforce competition and sometimes strife between groups. It's experienced rapid economic growth, averaging about 10% per year since 2005. And that means that today's GDP is 4.1 times the size that it was in 2005. And so that's a major transformative sort of change within this country. There's been a construction boom, many more cars and trucks on the road than the first time I visited in 1999, and a manufacturing boom with aspirations of becoming kind of a light manufacturing hub for the world. Ethiopia has also experienced rapid population growth. And this is a figure from populationpyramid.net. In the 1950s, there were 18.1 million. By the time of the Ethiopian famine around the mid 80s, about 40 million people. Today, 114, and the projection is that it'll reach up to about 205 million by 2050. My impression in doing field work in about 2000 was that in fact, Ethiopia was pretty close to out of land, arable land for farming. And so this will be an increasing challenge going forward. So the structure of this talk, I'll talk a bit about modern humans. I'll talk a bit about the MSA to late Stone Age transition in Ethiopia, which is some ways bound with the origin of modern humans. Climatic background, which we think may have been important for hunting and gathering societies. And then talk about the survey that we did to try to find new sites and excavate them. And then overview of some of our main findings. And finally, I'll concentrate on the key site, the most important one that we found and sampled, called Goda Buticha. And then talk a little bit about climate change and culture at Goda Buticha. All right, so the origin of modern humans. The 2021 view of the origin of modern humans is not really that it's an event, it's much more of a process. There's a kind of a creeping consensus towards that view, that it's not really possible anymore to put a single time period on which the species evolved as a sort of a point in time, that it seems to have been much more of a process. And ultimately, research on it involves integration of evidence from archaeology, human paleontology, genetics, and also paleoecology. So it's a kind of an interesting and complex problem. So the first modern human fossils date from anywhere from 320 up to 100,000 years ago in rough numbers. Genetics seems to indicate there was a major pulse of people out of Africa between 50 to 70,000 years ago that gave rise to most of the population outside of Africa. It's over about 95% of our genes or more. So why did modern humans evolve at all? Well, there's a long history of speculation on this and no potentially concrete answers that are widely agreed. One possibility is that there was genetic drift or selection on small subdivided populations in Africa. And those sorts of scenarios tend to place an emphasis that beneficial adaptations arose in some of these populations and then spread, allowing them to also perhaps expand in size and number. Another set of explanations focuses on climate cycles. And this was a period of pretty substantial climatic change, as you'll see in a minute. And these sorts of explanations often involve a fair amount of contingency or chance. So potentially some of the times in which modern humans spread from Africa or even within Africa may have been governed by chance events that were really ruled by climate. And so some of the eventual dominance of modern humans may in fact be due to some of these chance events. And potentially this means that perhaps good luck rather than good genes ruled the day. And so this is a map showing you, or a figure showing you, then the red curve is global sea level as measured by oxygen 18 content of foraminifera from the seabed. And it shows you a series of glacial cycles. So the low points in this curve would be glaciations, high points would be warm periods. We're over here right now in marine isotope stage 1. It's quite warm. It was actually warmer in stage 5e way back here, but it's also been substantially colder. So stage 6, stage 4, stage 2 were particularly difficult periods of glaciation on land and low sea level. The origin of modern humans now stretches way back into the past. There seems to have been at least one out of Africa event 125,000 years ago, a second one at roughly 60,000 years ago. And both of these correspond to upticks in those warm cycles from basically warmer or colder, drier periods before. Another set of explanations for why modern humans arose is that improved cultural adaptations that involve the middle Stone Age to later Stone Age shift drove this. and then allowed for the success of modern humans outside of Africa as well. So we'll focus now on the Middle Stone Age to Later Stone Age transition in Ethiopia, and also some aspects of the paleoecological background for this. So this is an old figure that was put together by Hamilton in the 1980s, showing you terrestrial records. These are lakes, lake sediments samples, and it's modeling the lake levels from 40,000 years ago here all the way up to the present for a series of Rift Valley lakes in East Africa. From Lake Victoria is over here. It was dry about 14,000 years ago and then filled rapidly to modern levels. Lake 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝗏 is basically one of the northernmost Rift Valley lakes in Ethiopia, pretty close to where we did this research. And you can see that it remained fairly dry during this period, then filled rapidly, and it's fluctuated. And it's basically a different story with different lakes, but definitely a filling of many of these lakes starting at around 14,000 years ago. So this period that I've got circled or boxed in with the blue box is called the last glacial maximum. It's part of marine isotope stage 2. And it was named the Big Dry in some of the literature recently. It's a period in which a lot of the archaeological sites peter out. There's many fewer than there were before and many fewer than there were after. There are some, and we'll talk more about that. It is basically, this contains the last glacial maximum, or LGM, which is a particularly trying time for many parts of the world and involved massive climatic change and shifts in ecotones. Marine isotope stage 4, earlier in time, is often argued to be somewhat analogous to stage 2, slight differences in some ways, but very similar sorts of challenges. Okay, so this is a map showing you some of these Rift Valley lakes to sort of the middle part of Ethiopia here. The dark blue shows you the maximum extent of the lakes, and the light blue kind of modern extent. These figures are simply seasonal rainfall, and you see it fluctuates quite a bit over these different areas. This is a topography map showing you these same lakes, showing you how high the Ethiopian plateau and Kenyan plateaus are here. Lake Turkana, where a lot of fossils have been found adjoining it, is actually fairly low for these levels, but many of these other lakes are pretty high. Finally, another fairly recent set of climatic data has come from a place called 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, which is in southern Ethiopia, very close, southwestern, very close to Lake Turkana. And today it's a dry lake bed for the most part, seasonally filled shallowly at some ways. But in the past, they've actually got a really good record now of fluctuations in precipitation on those surrounding highlands in southern Ethiopia, with very low lake levels at about 20,000 years ago. Here's the younger Dryas when it just very rapidly dried out, followed by refilling, and then into the middle Holocene, again, a drying trend. Okay, so let me say a few more words about the Middle Stone Age to Later Stone Age transition. Generally, this involves the appearance or proliferation of blades, microliths, and more rapid pace of cultural change into the LSA. It also is sometimes marked by the appearance or proliferation of beads, art, and other evidence of symbolic communication, as well as sometimes more evidence of long-distance trade or exchange. And sometimes people have argued that more effective hunting may have been part and parcel of this. In southern Africa, poisoned arrows and poisoned arrow technology almost certainly seems to have been a part of this, and very early. These changes in southern Africa seem to arise as a block, but over Africa as a whole, they show a gradual pattern of buildup, as McBrady and Brooks fairly persuasively argued a couple of decades ago. Okay, so turning to the Horn of Africa, and that's Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, and Eritrea. One of the key sites from this is the site of Porcupig, which means porcupine in French, And this is close to the city of 𝗤𝗓𝗏𝗏 that's in the the Ethiopian Rift Triangle on the southern side of that Rift Valley. And it's an old railroad town going from Djibouti up to the highlands at Addis Ababa. But there's a cave site over a stream, seasonal stream that runs to the town, and that's called Porcupig Cave. This was initially excavated in the 1930s and then again pretty intensively in the 70s, and has produced one of the key cultural sequences for this time period. It's a pretty strenuous hike from the wadi up to the cave, but when you get up there, this is what you see. The old excavation has removed a lot of the sediment from here. The Pleistocene sediments are capped by a thick layer of flowstone from the beginning of the Holocene. And one of the key people that analyzed this was Desmond Clark, kind of the doyen of African archaeology. And he proposed a model for the Middle Stone Age to Later Stone Age transition in the Horn of Africa involving evidence from Porcupig Cave as well as other sites in the vicinity. And he argued that it involved a form of leptolithicization, basically really narrow, sort of small, narrow points, but using Lavalois technology that had characterized the Middle Stone Age or much earlier in time. Okay, so one of the key things that was needed is simply more evidence for this area, and especially better dating evidence for sites like Porcupig or new sites that could be found. And with an eye to doing that, Zelalem Assefa and David Pleurdeau and Erella Hovers initiated the Southeastern Ethiopia Cave Survey Project. And this was aimed at trying to get more of sites with datable archaeological assemblages. This was aided in the area around 𝗤𝗓𝗏𝗏 by the presence of the Southeastern Ethiopian Rift Wall, climbing up to the highlands, is made up of Jurassic limestone. That contains lots of caves that can trap cultural residues. And the chemistry of that limestone also aids in bone preservation. So there's a better chance of getting animal bones and hominins out of there that can give us some insight into hunting patterns and behaviors and so on. Okay, and so our wish list of things that we might be able to get from a cave would be Middle Stone Age and Later Stone Age lithics, bones that could shed light on hunting as well as paleoecology, evidence of symbolic behavior, that's one of the big questions here, hominin bones. And for the very latest periods of time, it's also of great interest to try to track the evidence and spread of food production, especially domestic animals and domestic crops, if those could be sampled. There was another model that was pretty prevalent at the time we proposed this, and that was a model by Stan Ambrose based on central Kenya, that as the climate fluctuated, especially during cold, dry periods, the forest would have retreated upslope. And his argument was that humans followed them. There seemed to be pretty good archaeological evidence for this, with concentrations of MSA sites that are somewhat higher than you see today. And we wanted to test whether this was the same in Ethiopia. The short answer to this, which I won't talk about much more, is that we didn't find much evidence of it in the highlands. And either the sites are no longer there, they may have been eroded away, or it simply may have not been there. Okay, and so this is a satellite map showing you this area. This is Porcupig on the southern part of this rift wall. Goda Buticha is very close nearby. There's a series of other Ethiopian sites going down the Rift Valley to the south. And there's also some now known from northern Somalia, kind of following this rift wall eastward. So these are the project members. I'm not going to read all the names, but a fairly international team. And again, the results that we've been able to get has really been a result of the collaboration of all of these folks. So field work, in 2007, we began survey work. 2008, we did some test excavations of promising sites, as well as more survey. And in 2011, we came back for more excavation and a tiny bit more survey. So what I'd like to do now is to zoom in on this area and show you, this is the area of 𝗤𝗓𝗏𝗏 is pinned here, and I'll zoom into the rift wall here. So this is now flipped around with north facing down here. And this is showing you the Rift Valley. You can see how dry it is with all kinds of dirt that's eroded from the highlands deposited in it. And you can see the green of the highlands is basically cooler and also wetter than as you go down into the valley. And so this is a map of all the sites we surveyed up to 2014. There basically, many of them were along the kind of the rift wall going up. We did some in the highlands as well, but these generally seem to be late and not terribly promising for our interests. Wherever we went, this was kind of an interesting experience. We aroused an awful lot of curiosity, and these are local kids being kids. But it was really interesting. These areas are fairly densely populated, especially as you go up into the highlands. Almost every bit of agricultural land is occupied. A whole bunch of archaeological sites we identified and sampled. This is one that was actually an open air site. It may be a secondary deposit of stuff that has washed down a bit from the highlands, but most of the edges appear to be very fresh, not heavily rolled, and so on. This is one of the few sites up in the close to the highlands that we identified as promising. You can see some of the lithics in situ there, rock hyrax hiding and observing the proceedings there. This is another one of the sites we sampled that was not so promising for our purposes. It's one called Istalenko West. And it had a whole bunch of what appeared to be fairly late artifacts, some pottery sherds, which are the kiss of death for Paleolithic archaeologists, usually indicates a much later occurrence of materials. And one of the sites we identified in 2017 was Goda Buticha. Here we are at the foot of the cave at the village, and you have to basically climb up this slope, avoiding cactuses to get to the mouth of the cave there. Oops. Goda Buticha had in situ lithics that looked fairly promising. Some of these appeared to be perhaps Middle Stone Age in age. It also had bones and teeth eroding from the sediment, and that was very promising. Many of the other sites we occupied or looked at were later Stone Age, appear to be mostly later Stone Age sites with art. Here's one example of this, a place called Goda Wanji. It has some unusual, fairly abstract forms in art. But this is what's happened to it today. It's been basically covered with graffiti by local people, not preserved. It's basically essentially destroyed as a rock art site, very unfortunately. Here's another site. It's called 𝗭𝗲𝗄. And at the foot of this, Desmond Clark and colleagues did a small excavation. It also has some pretty spectacular rock art. And this is a panel showing cattle, very stylized. Some lithics are still present there. These are basically little or later Stone Age style, very small artifacts and small blades, as well as some animal bones. This is a traffic jam near 𝗭𝗲𝗄 as we were trying to leave. A lot of the local people are traditionally herders, and this is a herd of camel. This is basically mobile wealth for pastoral people. This is another rock art site called Goda Desa. This one was really fascinating because in addition to some domestic animals like a cow up here, it shows a series of wild animals. So an elephant, some sort of carnivore, a smaller carnivore, and a long horned ibex or similar antelope. And so this is really interesting. Most of the cave art in Ethiopia switches to only domestic animals later in time, and so this one was particularly interesting. Goda Desa, we went back in 2011. It looked to have some promise, and this is just a small sample of things that we saw there. So by the end of 2007, we had identified several sites, and we went back to test them in 2008. And so this is one of those sites that looked the most promising. We excavated that. It's called Gilbo Tate. It has a whole series of interesting lithics with carbonate incrustations on them, but had no bones and also showed signs of pretty major sediment disturbance. And that makes it sort of a very not so promising candidate to excavate. So we ended up back at Goda Buticha, and this means cave of the ghost in Oromo. It's apparently a fairly widespread belief in among Oromo people that caves are associated with sort of supernatural and ghosts in particular. And so I'll zoom in and show you where this site is. There it is pinned from Google Earth, and we're zooming in here close to the town of 𝗏𝗏. There's the site near a village. You can flip back here and you can see the village with some irrigated land around here. Flipping in closer to the cave now, we've flipped around from the north, basically looking south towards it. And here is from the east, basically looking west. There's the cave, and there's a large sort of area of irrigated land and villages for the local farmers. Okay, so this is Goda Buticha. It's located at the top of the hill. It's a fairly narrow gallery that opens up into this limestone. And here it is when we started our excavation in 2008. We thought that this was a pit that was dug by animals, but apparently it's actually a pit that was dug by a looter, basically someone looking for cultural materials similar to what archaeologists were excavating. And he did a lot of damage in a fairly short period of time. But the positive of that is that we were able to sort of pre-sample this and see that in fact there were animal bones and stones going all the way down in this deposit. So there it is at the beginning. While we were working in 2008, world events intruded. And as we sat at our hotel in the evenings, like watching the evening news, this is what we saw. It was basically the period in which the Dow Jones was in free fall. And we just would sit there in disbelief and wonder what exactly we were going to come back to find. So this is excavation at Goda Buticha in 2008. And we took a pretty narrow slice, basically all the way down to the bottom to sort of see what we could see in this cave site. And there it is after excavation. The top sediments are this kind of very fine white ash, and then you get into brown sediments below that, and then more concretions, kind of solidified almost sediments as you get close to the base. So what we found were lots of what we thought were MSA lithics, some large faunal bones, as well as lots and lots of microfauna, tiny mice and other things probably accumulated by owls. There were human remains, some really small fragments, teeth and other bits. There were also, we found an ostrich eggshell bead. And if this was indeed Middle Stone Age, this would be a very exciting sort of finding to have. Lots of charcoal and even wood in what we thought were MSA levels. This is a kind of an alarming thing for an archaeologist to find. In my knowledge, the oldest wood and plant stuff associated with MSA is about 20,000 years old from South Africa. And so this was, we began to think this was maybe a bit younger than that might have been instead. Or one of the other kind of worrying aspects of this is that you might have had a whole bunch of bioturbation that had mixed up sediments and perhaps destroyed the stratigraphic integrity. So this is an initial layout of some of the findings and stratigraphy that we had. And we submitted a lot of those carbon or charcoal samples we had for radiocarbon dates. And here's what we got. Oops, go here. Much of this lower deposit that we thought was Middle Stone Age because it had some Levallois style points and other things in it is actually mid Holocene, really, from about 6,000 to 7.7 thousand years ago. But below that, as things began to get a bit more concreted, there's a sudden jump in age to about 33,900 years ago, and perhaps even older. This is a really kind of interesting thing. We didn't notice any particular change in the stratigraphy. We didn't notice any sort of obvious break in the soil or anything like that. But this was a major difference in the chronology. So in 2011, we went back. These are simply some flowers that I spotted out on survey in a farmer's field, just absolutely beautiful morning glories. And here's one of the interesting things. This is up in the highlands at a place called 𝗏𝗶𝗂𝗆𝗆. And these are people who insisted on us photographing them in traditional Oromo dress. And this is sort of a local folk, a bunch of local people who are basically out there being Oromo, and they want others to see them in that light. And this was really tied to a movement that has been gathering steam in Ethiopia that's probably been fueled by this system of ethnic federalism to some extent, with a lot of peoples who have not been the dominant ethnic group chafing for more independence and more say in their own affairs. This was followed by about 2016 by a whole series of violent events. It led to a change in the Ethiopian government, but the area where we were doing archaeology is right at about in here, in one of the areas where this has been fairly prominent. And for that reason, it's been very difficult to go back. Basically, conditions on the ground since 2011 have not been good. All right, so back in 2011, we were able to go back to this cave and take another slice down that allowed us to get kind of a better sample of many of the materials we wanted to. We also tried to get, and did get, optically stimulated luminescence samples to get potentially ages going far beyond 50,000 if in fact the sediments allowed. At the site, sedimentation continues, and this is in fact a 𝗖𝗫𝗵𝗿𝗃𝗃, which is now capping the deposit, at least in 2011. We also found some of those deep in the deposit, and it appears that hyenas came in and out. So the human presence there was probably fairly ephemeral. This is a traditional goat corral. It's basically made out of acacia brambles and is designed mainly to keep hyenas out and to keep baby goats and other goats safe. So this is some local people busy sorting, picking out any sort of interesting items from the kind of looks like the coarse sieve right there. Lunch break, busy taking total station measurements as we excavated for piece plotting sediments in various pieces. And this is Zelalem Assefa and Asfawossen Asrat, who is our geologist. Zelalem's specialty is really zooarch. Near the end of the 2011 field season, and this, it turns out to go down to about 40 to even 60,000 years ago in age. And so here's what we got. So it turns out in stars, you see little bits of human remains that we found. These are tiny isolated bones or teeth. And it turns out almost all of these are from roughly the 7,000 year time slice. One is a little piece of cranial vault that's, can't really say a whole lot about, but it's from deeper down in the deposit. Interestingly, this area that we thought was Middle Stone Age and brown is only filled with wild animals. So all of the bones we found are of wild fauna. There are some domestic fauna that occur in this white ash. So we know that agriculture and herding at least had come in by that time. So dating, one of our goals was to get better dates for OSL. We had an initial set of carbon-14 dates, and these are basically them. You can see again, there's this big gap between 7 and roughly 34,000 years ago. And so it turned out that from the OSL dates, they largely repeated this. And so the OSL dates also found this major gap in sedimentation. Work on the minerals within the sediment itself by Jean-Jacques Bahain indicated that most of this deposit was laid down under fairly dry conditions. One of the worries had been that perhaps water seeping through the cave had removed some of it, but this does not seem to be the case. The minerals themselves don't seem to support that. And so here's a list of these OSL dates we got. It largely follows the radiocarbon, and it indicates that between roughly by OSL 6.9 to 24,000 years ago, there seems to be a gap. It's a bit longer of a gap by calibrated carbon-14. Okay, so how does this square with the paleoecology? Well, one of the things that's proposed, and proposed by many, to be a substantial influence on the archaeology was that really dry period of the last glacial maximum, and there it is. In Goda Buticha, The gap by OSL would be in this small red dotted box. And you can see that locally within Ethiopia, this would correspond to the dry period, as well as the beginning of the returns of rain within this time period. So it looks as if humans didn't reoccupy this immediately after rain started. There was a bit of a delay. And if you go to the carbon-14 chronology, it's an even longer gap, but it ends at about the same period of time. So we were able to do some other analysis at this site as well. David Pleurdeau, Erella Hovers, and especially 𝗖liche 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗆𝗆 did a whole series of analyses of the lithics from this site. And 𝗖liche also worked again on the samples from 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗏 in comparison from Porcupig. And so there are various styles of core reduction that were used here. The Middle Stone Age is interesting because in some areas you get one style of core reduction basically predominating. And this one, there seems to be a whole bunch of different ones that were used. There's the presence of elongated blades and bladelets going back all the way to the bottom of the deposit. They become more frequent later in time. And Levallois flakes and blades that are produced, and points produced throughout this sequence up to the white ash. And this is some work from the people who did the lithics, Pleurdeau and 𝗵𝗏𝗏𝗏 and Hovers, found that there's an interesting temporal period, temporal pattern going from early times to the very late at top, where the number of retouched points gradually declines. This is sort of a classic indicator of the Middle Stone Age, so those begin to decline. And the number of backed microliths, which is sort of one of the classic features of the LSA, gradually increase over time with a pretty dramatic increase near the top of this deposit here. And I've plotted that temporal break right in there with this sort of orange dotted line. And interestingly, it basically is a relatively smooth transition. Before the break and after seem relatively similar. And this is a really sort of interesting feature. We also found a variety of ostrich eggshell beads. Turns out this is a finished bead. This one that looks like it was perhaps made by the Flintstones is actually an early stage of production where you cut a rough outline of the bead, you drill a hole, and then you gradually reduce it until you have the rounded form that you'd like. We also found some human remains, and these are them. One of the most significant of these is a little bit of a proximal thumb phalanx. That's basically this part of your thumb close to the palm. And the one from Goda Buticha is really small. So when I measured it and plotted it against some other African origin samples that I've been able to measure, it is on the small end, even for Khoisan people from Southern Africa, who are kind of renowned as fairly small in size. This is a really tiny individual. You would almost not see an individual of this size in African American or Zulu people from Southern Africa. So really, really small in size. And this is interesting. At about the same time, there seem to have been some larger populations that lived in the Rift Valley, even in Ethiopia, and certainly south around Lake Turkana, there were taller people. The teeth also seem to be fairly small. This is like the modern population and pretty different than Middle Stone Age people that have been sampled elsewhere in Africa. And that small thumb seems to indicate a very small body size. Okay, so the last thing to talk about here is how this squares with climate change. And so Goda Buticha appears to have been abandoned during the worst phases of this climatic change. So as things got really dry, people appear to have just abandoned the area as far as we can tell from the Goda Buticha area. And this is basically from almost the start of marine isotope stage 2 until about 7,000 years ago. And again, that's a bit after rain and vegetation and presumably animals had returned to this area. It turns out that abandonment during the last glacial maximum is a fairly common phenomena for sites that have kind of long sediment sequences from East Africa. So it's been repeated at a whole series of sites. It appears to be fairly common pattern. Interestingly, people persisted in some places. So the Nile Valley was kind of a remarkable example of this. It actually seems to have been a better place to live in some ways during the last glacial maximum than before or after. There seems to be lots of evidence of people there. And at 7,000 years ago, people brought back very similar techniques and technology for making stone tools. And this is really an immense gap of time in which things seem really similar at the far end of it. And this has really been sort of a head scratcher. To really resolve this, we would like to go back and excavate a larger sequence within Goda Buticha to make absolutely sure that there's no evidence of sediment mixing or any other thing that could explain this at present based on sedimentological analysis and the relative integrity of carbon-14 dates and OSL dates. They follow the sequence they ought to. There appears to be not a major amount of sediment mixing. But again, really nailing this down seems to be an important thing to follow up with. And this is interesting. It seems to suggest that there perhaps was some cultural continuity for thousands of years. And there's also emerging evidence of different cultural traditions elsewhere in Ethiopia. And one of the fascinating ones from the last couple of years is examples from the Bale Highlands in southern Ethiopia. This is a very high kind of dry moorland today. But there's evidence that people were there around the time of the last glacial maximum, basically doing intensive hunting of small rodents that lived in that area. And so this is fascinating. It's evidence of people persisting, perhaps in the sort of zone where Ambrose would have suggested that they lived, and in very trying climatic conditions. And so that's it for my talk. And let me say thank you, and thank you to our funding sources and to all the local people who helped with this research. And with that, let me open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Ozzie, for your talk. Please feel free to just unmute if you have a question and show your video and go ahead and ask.
Hi, Ozzie.
Hi, Lawrence.
So that's a rather remarkable gap. There's I guess a lesson in it for all of us cave archaeologists. These kinds of things happen, but that is a huge gap, especially one that had no visible manifestation when you were excavating back from the pothole. I love potholes. Potholes are great because they allow us to get at the old stuff without having to shovel, which we can't do anymore. Anyway, it looks like, sedimentation stopped. If you can eliminate, for sure, any kind of massive running water episode, it means that the sedimentation utterly stopped for some 25,000 years. Is that really in the cards? During the LGM, it presumably is extremely dry. There's presumably very little vegetation in the area. You would imagine you'd have aeolian deposition of blowing sands and very fine loess-like silts in the air. What do the geologists have by way of an explanation for such a gap? Also, a side question: how big an area did you actually manage to excavate? Pretty small, I gather, right?
It's really small. Yeah, it's about a meter deep and about 2 meters down, and about 2 meters across. So it's small.
Right. So you got a sample area then of two square meters, right? Something like that. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So that point you raised about the gap is the $64,000 question here. And further excavation would really be essential to resolve that. The sedimentologist we had argued that in fact there was no evidence of massive flowing water that could have removed this. You know, the other thing that could remove it is human action, in which humans simply shoveled out a bunch of stuff that was there. That would do it. That would create a
Is there
gap.
any evidence that the site was used for stabling animals or for removal of guano? Or is there guano deposition in these caves?
There is, yeah, there is guano deposition. There's bats currently live there and they poop everywhere. The area that you see with burned sediment on top is almost certainly burned guano. And so that almost certainly is goats. What pastoralists often will do is they'll burn the surface of the cave.
Yes.
And then put the goats in there. And we have some evidence of that, but it's very late in time. And so it's much later than that 7,000 year time slice.
Yeah. Do they have any indication of Aeolian deposition, the geologists?
Yeah, there seems to be early on and through that 7,000 year time period, there does seem to be quite a bit of Aeolian deposition.
In the Holocene?
Yes.
So you would imagine with lessened vegetation in the LGM and in the late glacial, you would imagine there should be a lot of Aeolian deposition. And so where is it? That's really strange.
It is strange, yeah.
Well, good luck getting back there. Of course, things in Ethiopia are not doing too good. Of course, that's up in the north now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Lawrence. There's a question from T. I don't know if they want to ask the question. If so, you can unmute. Otherwise, I'll read it. Okay, so the question was, outside of ostrich shell beads, were there any other bird remains, such as bones?
Oh, good question. No bird bones that I recall. Zelalem Assefa did all the faunal identifications. So there were none that I recall he found. There was a huge number of pieces of ostrich eggshell, just broken fragments. It looks as if people were collecting these and consuming them, almost certainly. In Southern Africa, these are often used as water containers as well. And we were able to find a few of them that were burned and also scored with crosshatch marks. They appear to be almost at random in orientation for the most part, but a few of them have more kind of right angles than you might expect by chance. They appear to have been at least utilized by people, possibly intentionally scored by them. It's thought that an awful lot of the microfauna, and some places there was microfauna throughout this sequence in abundance, but near the top, there were some levels that were just choked with this, and these are almost certainly owl pellets. So this appears to have been a roosting place for owls. And probably that means that humans are not there very consistently.
Right.
And they have basically vacuumed up the surrounding territory of micromammals and deposited them for the benefit of paleoecologists later in time.
So do we have more questions?
A follow-up, Ozzie. Do you know of other sites, other cave sites in East Africa that have a similar gap? I mean, I'm thinking of course, the record from South Africa, which, if memory serves me well, there are some massive gaps in some of the classic South African caves. Is there also evidence from East Africa of gaps of that magnitude of time?
Yeah, good question. So yes, there are, and they're actually pretty striking. So Porcupig has a whole series of Pleistocene sediments that we think end somewhere between 60 to 30,000 years ago, and dating that site is a really kind of a key item on the wish list. But that goes up to about 30,000, then stops. There's a flow stone, and then there's basically Holocene sediments above that. So that seems to end right about the time that Goda Buticha probably has the gap. There's another site called 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 about 40,000 years ago, then there's a gap. And then there's kind of Holocene sediments above that. In Kenya, the site of 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 has basically the same sort of thing. It goes up to about the last glacial maximum. There's a gap. People are back in about 8,000 or so years ago. So these seem to be pretty widespread, actually. And I believe at Nasera Rock, there's been an effort by Christian Trion and colleagues to try to redate collections and carbon samples from there that have produced something that's pretty analogous.
So this is the big research question for the geomorphologists.
See, we've got time for some more questions. Please feel free to unmute your video and go ahead and ask.
I saw you had a chat question from someone asking you if the phalange was a adult or a child.
Okay, yeah, so that is definitely an adult. So with a proximal thumb phalanx like that, there's a base on it. The very base part will actually fuse on in late adolescence, about 14 or so years of age. So that's a person that's older than that. So that bone is done with its maturation. That's as long as it will get. It's adult.
Well, I have a kind of tangential question. I'm curious, with the people that you were working with there, it sounds like you said they were mostly Oromo people. What kinds of conversations did they have about what they were doing? How did they think about the work that you were doing and its significance for them? I know that's not part of your research questions, but I imagine you did overhear those kinds of conversations.
I did. So I got those often by sort of two links of translation. So they would go from Oromo often to Amharic and then to English to me. And so, yeah, there's a massive amount of information lost, I think, at each level. And generally, I think what we were doing was somewhat inexplicable. It just didn't fit with any sort of local knowledge or experience about this. I think the last time archaeologists were there was in the 1970s. And so I think some of the very elderly people there might remember some of those visits, but it was really outside of the experience of most people. And they really kind of weren't sure what we were doing. It was really a difficult thing. But eventually the folks at Goda Buticha became really pretty positive, and we tried to make sure that various people from the village would have turns working for us. It was pretty good wages compared to what you could usually get in this environment. At a broader level, there could also be some resentment because you had representatives of the national government there who were often Amharic speaking peoples and were kind of this representative of this Amharic hegemony within that society. We also had some folks who were representatives of the local Oromo government as part of that ethnic federal system. And that was a much smoother sort of articulation with local people for the most part. And so the Oromo government has, at least to my mind, been fairly efficient and fairly good about managing those sorts of things. But for the most part, I think we seemed like we had landed from Mars or something. It really did not fit with local experience or expectations.
Hi, Dr. Pearson.
Hello.
You might have gone over this, but how did you know which caves to initially survey?
Good question. So many of these had been sampled or identified earlier in time. this is not a great way to do survey. This is how Zelalem had set it up to do. So many of these had been known from rock art research. Some of them had been test excavated. Goda Buticha, there is some rock art in an adjacent cavern. There are little tiny figures of herd animals, but there had not been any archaeological sample of it. And so when we saw that looter's pit that had all of the artifacts and bones in it, we knew that we had really kind of struck gold. And for most of the other ones, we simply looked at surface or tailings from them to see if there were lithics and bones eroding out from those deposits. And if there was nothing, we basically moved on.
And you knew the location of all these places to look based off of previous research or previous attempted excavation or survey? Okay.
Yes, that's right. So there's another way to do this sort of thing if you know absolutely nothing about it. And this is the sorts of things that Desmond Clark did. And that way is to really walk up stream cuts. And so you go up into a landscape, and where every time that a stream has eroded down, it's naturally cut the landscape. And you can look along that landscape for eroding lithics at various spots and try to basically sample it that way. So that's sort of a de novo way of going about this it can be very productive.
Okay, thank you.
We do have time for more questions. We can go past 11 if you want to continue the discussion.
I have one.
Oh, please go ahead.
Are there any ethnological accounts or any stories or folklore of what this cave was used for by the local villagers?
That's a great question. And the short answer is I have no idea, almost certainly. There's none that I know of that have been recorded. We weren't able to record that. It would be a matter of someone who's an ethnographer who actually speaks Oromo would be the best case scenario to actually record it.
It's probably her. Take the phone, Eva.
So one of the other things that's of interest there is many of these areas in the 1970s were kind of on the ragged edge of what was inhabited, period, by people in the area. And the population has absolutely expanded hugely since then. So many of the areas, including that rock art site with the destroyed rock art, were fairly remote from human settlement at the time. And now they're right next to villages and right next to people. And so there may not have been much of knowledge of this area at that time. I'm not really sure. That's a good question, and there's not a great answer. There's one other thing I could show people. This is a map actually showing you Ethiopia, and is color-coded by language group. So the ones in yellow and green are and orange are what are called Afro-Asiatic languages. The orange one is a whole bunch of small languages. It's whether they really fit into the Afro-Asiatic family of languages is debatable. According to many linguist experts. Yellow are what are called Cushitic languages like Somali, Afar, and Oromo. And green is Semitic languages like Amharic and Tigrayan and Eritrean. And these are basically very closely related to languages from Southern Arabia and the Middle East. And then you go over here to Nilo-Saharan languages, which are really part of a very different language family. But it's been argued by Christopher Ehret and others, linguists who work on these languages, that in fact, Ethiopia may have been a center for the differentiation and eventual spread of waves of people speaking different Afro-Asiatic languages. And he produced in 2009, along with some genetic analysis, this tree, which makes a variety of other linguists scream because you get into the really speculative aspects of linguistic reconstruction as you go later in time. As you go close to the present down here, it becomes increasingly certain, but these very distant relationships become much less certain. But interestingly, it's thought that the ancestor of Cushitic languages would have been around 10,000 years ago. If these Omotic languages are really part of Afroasiatic, perhaps around 15,000 years ago. And that interestingly puts a lot of the events that I'm talked about today within this sort of time frame of these cultures and presumably people splitting up and going their separate ways, which is kind of a fascinating sidelight on this.
Let's see. Here is another question. Was the destroyed rock art due to cultural beliefs or simply destructive behavior, such as limiting access versus graffiti?
I don't think it was like an intentional destruction. I think it was just graffiti. We don't have any interviews or people with people to really check that, which was perhaps what you would like to do. But it looked to me just like graffiti, but a lot of it.
I was interested to see the linguistic data that you put up there, and thinking about how this might interact with language. And you know, of course, as you pointed out, it's, you know, dates in historical linguistics are extremely approximate. You know, more approximate even than, you know, dates of bones and things like that. Way more, and it's all relative. But another factor that shapes that is how people switch languages, how languages shift, and that has to do with, you know, social ideologies about what languages are and how they line up with identities and geography. And, you know, in some places, those kinds of maps with bounded areas are deceptive because languages appear in sort of more like a mosaic scattered around. You have places where there's, you know, linguistic exogamy, where people marry people who speak other languages, like in the 𝗏𝗏𝗏 in Amazonia. So I wonder if there's if you know of anything about those sort of language patterns in Ethiopia. That's I really don't. That might shed some light on that. That might sort of enrich that connection.
Yeah, I do. Let me see if I can go back to share that screen with folks. So let me go back here a couple of slides. Whoops. All right. So if you look at this map, this shows you the different language families.
I think it's not shared.
Oh, do you see it?
No.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Let me see. I think it did not get shared. Oops. Share screen. Share.
There we go.
Can you see it now? Okay. So let me just go back here. So with this one, the most linguistically complicated areas in Ethiopia are right here in the southern and far western regions. And this is, these are incredibly complex with all of those dynamics in operation and still kind of ongoing. There are neighboring valleys that speak different languages. It's a lot like kind of like Papua New Guinea in the highlands. Really, really complex ethnic relationships. The rest of it is, I mean, all of it I think is deeply structured historically, but Ethiopia within the last 3,000 years, or even less than that, has experienced this massive expansion of people from the north speaking Semitic languages. And it seems from linguistic borrowings that Amharic picked up a lot of terms from a Cushitic language. This is Christopher Ehret's work for the most part, from a Cushitic language called Aga that's still in this area, I think in pockets, really small areas around was today an Amharic area. And we know that historically, a lot of the Oromo people spread just within the 1500s, really, from southern Ethiopia upwards. So all of these factors are very much in operation, and there's been substantial fluctuation in languages spoken and so forth over very recent times. The empire of Ethiopia, which really ended with Haile Selassie, during the 1800s was in active expansion, trying to push to the south, and went through its own phases of trying to assimilate kind of smaller groups within this territory.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to think about how the kinds of diversity in practices might have helped people get through climate change, and also what role language might have played in that. I think we've got time for more questions if you like. Give one more chance for questions. Okay, well, thank you so much for your talk and for the enlightening discussion afterwards. And I would just want to mention that the talk will be posted on the YouTube channel of the department shortly, today or tomorrow. And hope to see you all at the next colloquium talk next Friday. Thank you.